Welcome everyone to Pontos Fathom Press. This is episode 26 of the Pontos Fathom podcast, and our topic today is J.R.R. Tolkien's Sauron and elements of necromancy. And I think what we want to talk about here are both the literal ones and some variations of it that might seem interesting as well. So some of the topics we'll talk about are the idea of undying and resurrection, and at the same time we will talk about this concept of the second coming within you, and what that sort of resonates with in, let's say, in popular culture and religious texts' views of this concept of resurrection. You know, we have a rich history of dying and rising gods, as they call them, right? And Sauron kind of fits the mold, right? Sauron he's got a huge backstory, and that's why we got the Silmarillion out here, because I think it explores some of Sauron's backstory. And I kind of want to pick Sauron just because it also kind of points out some interesting archetypes in this idea of the diminishing of influence in the physical realm and the increase of the influence in this sort of numinous realm, or this noetic realm, or this realm of spirit, right? Because by the end of The Lord of the Rings, it's simply an eye, right? And this eye is yet, its tentacles have reached into Saruman, right? And its tentacles have reached out from Mordor, and through expression, not only in orcs but even in the influence of the rings. And we see this across like a lot of properties, right? So the idea is Sauron, the undying Dark Lord. It's kind of a trope, but at the same time we have resurrection across the board, right? So with necromancy is a little bit different than resurrection, right? So for necromancy, and we've got this great reference here, necromancy in the Medici library. This is from the excellent edition here from Hadean Press. It's quite nicely done. These are Latin excerpts from the Medici library that have to do with necromancy. So we'll reference some of this. We'll also be looking at Pontos Fathom Press edition of the Necromancy of Nyarlathotep. And I think that the intersections that happen in this book are quite present in Sauron's story. And that's the idea of there's a dying and rising that happens elsewhere in Lord of the Rings with Gandalf, sort of, right? Gandalf goes under, he comes back, he's moved from the gray to the white. Saruman's given up the white by his corruption, right? So you've got that kind of reincarnation that happens, and that's a resurrection. But when we talk about the undead or the lich, right, I think Sauron is kind of like a lich. The idea of the Dark Lord who sets in motion, even after his death, ways to be risen again, right? And I think that with necromancy, we kind of have that idea of the echoes of the cult that would raise you back, right? So let's jump into Sauron first. I think if we jump into Sauron, one thing that's interesting in the beginning of the Silmarillion, we're talking about last week in our podcast, episode 25, if you want to go back and check that one out, we talked about Morgoth, right? And Morgoth was the fallen name sort of Melkor. Melkor was Tolkien's Satan. It's a sort of a Satan character. But he started out more Luciferian, right? He was more of a rebel. He was discord. It was termed in terms of music. So there was the music of the spheres. Melkor was the opposing music, the discord, the tension in music. Music requires all kinds of things, right? We need harmonies, and sometimes we have discords, And I'll talk a little bit about some musical references, just pepper them in there. But I think of, when we think of great harmonies, Think of the Beatles or something like that. They had great 2-part, 3-part harmonies, and we love the sound of that, from pop music. But then if you look at some discordant harmonies, think of Nirvana's Heart-Shaped Box, for example, or even Alice in Chains discordant harmonies, right? Those discordant harmonies kind of open something up for our ears, right? And I think that this is what the way Tolkien in the Silmarillion talks about Melkor, opening up these discordant harmonies. But later, as the wars rage on and the world happens, and Melkor's sort of Paradise Lost kind of story arc lands him as Morgoth, Sauron is there the whole time. Sauron is his lieutenant. So Sauron has some deep origins. And if we go into Silmarillion, and we talk about, it says, so we talked about the last of all the names as Melkor, he who arises in might, right? But then they got a new name. But the name that he fortified in the Noldor, who among the elves suffered most from his malice, will not utter it. And they name him Morgoth, the dark enemy, right? So this idea is how he fell from splendor through arrogance to contempt, a spirit wasteful and pitiless, right? So we talked about this as the Morgoth, it's Saturnian, the Saturnine energy in podcast 25. So this week we're going to focus on his lieutenant. It says, among those servants, right? So Morgoth has many servants, right? He was not alone, Morgoth, for the Maiar were drawn to his splendor in the days of his greatness. So when he was Melkor, he had many followers from the Maiar, and they remained in allegiance down to his darkness, and others he corrupted afterwards to his service with lies and treacherous gifts. Dreadful among these spirits were the Balrogs, the demons of terror, right? But among his servants that have named the greatest was the spirit whom the Eldar called Sauron, or in their language, Gorthaur the Cruel. Gorthaur the Cruel, or Sauron. In his beginning, he was of the Maiar of Aula, and he remained mighty in the lore of that people. In the deeds of Melkor and Morgoth upon Arda, in his vast works and in the deceits of his cunning, Sauron had a part, and was only less evil than his master, in that for long he served another and not himself. But in after years he rose like a shadow of Morgoth and a ghost of his malice, and walked behind him on the same ruinous path down to the void. This is the ending of the song of Iluvatar. This is the music of the Ainur, and it ends with this kind of this is the Valaquenta. So this is the Valaquenta, just talking about the Valar and the enemies. And so Sauron rises like a shadow of Morgoth and a ghost of his malice. Now this here word rising is so key, right? A rising force, a rising, right? Necromancy, rising from the dead, right? We've got here Lazarus, 2,000 years of the resurrection of Lazarus in art. So in some ways we see Lazarus, Jesus could raise Lazarus from the dead, and we call it raising from the dead, right? But when a dark intention is engaged with raising from the dead, we call that necromancy, right? And I think that that's a great distinction, kind of we talk about that confusion in necromancy of Nyarlathotep, where in a way, it doesn't seem right to call everyone who rises from the dead a zombie. Although zombies rise from the dead, we wouldn't call Jesus a zombie, right? And we wouldn't call Jesus a necromancer, traditionally, raising Lazarus from the dead, because necromancy seems to have the black art in it. So it's intention, right? There's an intention behind this, right? And I think if we kind of just pop open into Crowley for a second here, I just got this bookmarked passage. Just talking about Osiris. Okay, so the idea of Osiris, again, Egyptian god, goes into the underworld, right? So this is the idea of Lazarus dies and has to be risen back from the dead, right? So necromancy would be this raising from the dead. This, just talking about Osiris here, is in this revelation is the basis of the future aeon. Within the memory of man, we have the pagan period, the worship of nature, of Isis, of the mother of the past, the Christian period, the worship of men, of Osiris, and of the present. So I think here we're sort of loosely equating the Osirian resurrection story with the Jesus resurrection story. So this is the time where once there was a view of nature where we go into the earth and basically we compost, right? We just become the food for Mother Nature to consume us, right? And there's sort of this amorality to that, this idea that the earth can, listen, we grow our food in the earth. We call that fecundity of the earth. It's actually the death of other things that transform in the compost to provide food, to make rich soil, to make the planet grow, provide our atmosphere, all of these things. So that kind of Gaia view of things. Death doesn't have the baggage of some of these concepts. This is the pagan period, right? Sort of like nature worship, Mother Nature, Isis, right? Fertility. But then the Christian period, the worship of man and Osiris, I think this is where we have the Son of Man. And we say man here, I think we should just say human for people. So the idea of this human age that kind of culminates maybe in some ways with the Renaissance. And in other ways, it goes all the way up to the 20th century. I mean, we have sparks of hope in this, in the movements of, the past 100 years with labor movements, with civil rights movements of labor laws, protection of people, rise of healthcare, rise of standards of living. All of this is the effects of the age of humanity. And we look at Jung, and he talks about the ion being the phenomenology of the self as kind of like a Christ-like lesson. It's almost like the Christian era was a Christ-like lesson. So you're going back to Crowley here. He says, the worship of man of Osiris of the present. The first period is simple, quite easy and pleasant. The material ignores the spiritual. The second period, meaning the Christian period, is of suffering and death. The spiritual strives to ignore the material, right? Christianity and all cognate religions worship death, glorify suffering, and deify corpses. The new ion is the worship of the spiritual made one with the material, of Horus, of the child, and of the future. Isis was liberty, Osiris was bondage, and the new liberty is that of Horus. Isis conquered her. Osiris conquered her because she did not understand him. Horus avenges both his father and his mother. So this is the idea of Osiris rose up from death, but also kind of embodies death. And I think that this is that weird rejection that people have with... A lot of people have this rejection of Christian values because I think that they're frightened by or unable to understand that sacrifice that has to happen and that binding of spirit and man, human, right? So this is, do what thou wilt, that shall be the law. Refuse this and fall into the curse of destiny. Divide will against itself. It says, it is the law that Jesus Christ, or rather the Gnostic tradition of which the Christ legend is a degradation, attempted to teach, but nearly every word he said was misinterpreted and garbled by his enemies, particularly those who called themselves his disciples. In any case, the Aeon was not ready for the law of freedom. Of all his followers, only St. Augustine appears to have got a glimmer of what he meant. So here's a great call out to St. Augustine. The further attempt to reach this law is made through Sir Edward Kelly at the end of the 16th century. The bondage of orthodoxy prevented his words from being heard or understood. Change is not as much as a style of a letter. Success is your proof, right? So the key to the resolution of all human problems, both philosophical and practical. So here he's just talking about this idea of pagan era, Christian era, and then a post-Christian era, which means learning from the lesson of this, right? So again, let's go back to Sauron. Where does he fit in the Lord of the Rings? Sauron originally was an enemy of men and elves in the Second Age of Lord of the Rings. And after his defeat, So we see in those, if you're a fan of Tolkien from the books or of Silmarillion, or even from the movie, the great scene is when we see Sauron defeated the first time in that prequel part of the films, right? So the idea is Sauron was once a Dark Lord himself on the earth, at war, leading armies of orcs into battle against the elves. And we see here that after his defeat, it says, thus the black years began, which the elves called the days of light. And Sauron's lust and pride increased, and he knew no bounds, and he determined to make himself master of all things Middle-earth, to destroy the elves, and to compass, if he might, the downfall of Numenor. He booked no freedom nor any rivalry, and named himself the Lord of the Earth. So this is before the Lord of the Rings, right? Sauron sort of rises in power. To them, so he says that in the east and south, well nigh all men were under his dominion, and they grew strong in the days and built many towns and walls of stone, and they were numerous and fierce war and armed with iron. To them Sauron was both king and god, and they feared him exceedingly, for he surrounded his abode with fire. Yet there came at length a stay in the onslaught of Sauron upon the west. It is told he was challenged by the might of Numenor, and Sauron could not withstand them, and hoping to accomplish by cunning what he could not achieve by force, he left Middle-earth, and he went to Numenor as a hostage, and there he abode until the last days of craft, and corrupted the hearts of those people, and set them at war with the Valar, and compassed their ruin. And he had long been desired, and that ruin was more terrible than Sauron had foreseen, for he had forgotten the might of the lords of the west and their anger, and the world was broken, and the land was swallowed up, and the sea rose over it. So this is the destroying of Numenor. It's like the Atlantis story, right? And we've got a video about talking about the Silmarillion in Atlantis, which kind of goes into Numenor. Sauron himself went down into the abyss. Now here we go. Sauron, just like Osiris, or anyone dying, let's say, Sauron himself goes down into the abyss, but his spirit arose and fled back on the dark wind to Middle-earth, seeking a home. Right, so here it is, right? And then Sauron withdrew his fortress in the Black Land and mediated war. So Sauron goes down into the void. For all intents and purposes, he leaves the world, then only his spirit returns, right? So this return of spirit, again, it's a necromantic concept, right? So when we look at it from the point of view of a Dark Lord, it's kind of interesting because it seems to have baggage with it about monstrous proportions, right? These monstrous proportions of some ugly shadow evil that is down in some underworld. And yet there are smaller versions of this, right? So we have maybe a borderline gray path. Lazarus existing as an example of the power, right? It's a miracle that's meant to be an example. But when one tries to replicate that, one starts to get into trouble, right? So I think that maybe that's a place to leave that. If we look quickly in the Necromancy in the Medici Library, it's interesting how there are these lists of names and these lists of, lists of, I guess they would call them spells or experiments, let's call them. Like there's this one here that says the secret arts of the image, right? And this is translated from the Latin. It says, I conjure you by the God the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, by the Master of Arts, by his virtue, by the wisdom of Solomon, by the Sabaoth, by the Seraphim, by the true Emmanuel, by all the bodies and saints lie in Rome, by the moon and the sun and the Lord above, by the milk of the Virgin, by the blessed Mother, by the Holy Eucharist, by the body of Jesus, I conjure you and exercise you and commanding you, just as the deer wants for a spring of water, so blank shall want for my love. So this is a love incantation, right? This is a way to say, I want to summon. The pride here, I guess, is that the necromancer is trying to exert his own will and to subvert the the order of what is usually reserved for the deity. And as Crowley kind of says, this is that kind of antithesis to the Abrahamic religion mode, I guess. And it's surprising to see how reverent, in a way, some of this Crowley thought is. He's like, but Jesus' interpreters were wrong. Augustine got it right. And maybe Edward Kelly, which is Dr. D, maybe Dr. D's team was onto something, angelic script. So the idea of what was D on about, listening for the angelic language. And here's where we get into that idea of spirits. Now, if we talk about speaking in tongues, right, we talk about speaking in tongues from a Christian point of view, it seems quite palatable to say, oh, the Spirit speaks through me. But if we say, oh, we're summoning a demon, it seems unpalatable. So again, back to that range that we talk about in necromancy and Nyarlathotep, it's like, are we talking about Rilliez in the sunken city of Cthulhu, quote-unquote fear-based? Or are we talking about something that's the human past, the Atlantean past, maybe something love-based, something Venusian, something like this? There's that weird, and what we're seeing as we go from the fear side of things to the love side of things, right? From the dark side to the light side, from the left side to the right side, something like this, is we're actually seeing our own processing of the shadow with the baggage of culture, history, and what we bring to the, some of those archetypes that get brought into it. And also some of those formations, right? So these tensions. Going back to Tolkien, in the end, it was all music, right? In the end, it was all music. And I think if we extend the metaphor to the harmonies, I want to kind of go into this idea that the necromancy is a little bit like a musical cover song, right? An artist creates an amazing song, you want to sing it, right? And when you sing that song, it's sort of in the spirit of participating in the spirit of the song. The singer's voice is now coming through you. Now, rarely, and on occasion, you have the cases where a famous group, let's say a singer dies, go Alice in Chains, the singer dies, and a new singer comes in, right? A new singer can come into that group. Or a singer leaves a group. I mean, let's not even talk about it in the form of death. Let's move death out of the case. Black Sabbath, Ozzy was the singer, then Dio was the singer. And it's a different Black Sabbath, but it still kind of it's still following the narrative, let's say. But when a singer dies and another singer comes and sings the song for someone else, especially when they sing it in the style of that person, we'll often say, oh, he's just copying X. And if we kind of extend that, somewhat impolitely, I guess, if we channel it, if we're channeling that voice, if we channel the voice, now we're taking place into something that's blurring that line. It's definitely a gray art. It's like a Mithrandir kind of Gandalf the Grey thing. But the idea here is if you are allowing the voice to rise up through you, right? Now it just comes to what will you do with it now that you've given it presence in the now. You have a voice speaking it. So and I think this is where maybe that Augustine point that Crowley's making about St. Augustine and understanding how to process the Christian events as a human. We talk about City of God, we talk about Confessions, right? So some of those places where Augustine goes through his own life and then weighs how these things can affect him. And this is where we take the lesson and internalize it, right? So again, another one of these necromancy points here is it says the lists of names, right? So again, the list of names, I want to go back to this list of names. There's a list of the saints, he says, which I thought was quite strange. So in this one, I think listing the names, I want you to think of it as like covering a song, right? So here is the Gnostic Mass, right? And this is of the office of the collects, and it says the saints. The deacon, Lord of life and joy, that art the might of man, that art the essence of every true God that is upon the surface of the earth, continuing knowledge from generation into generation. And they're going to give glories to these saints. Lao Tzu, Siddhartha, Krishna, Tahuti, Moshe, Dionysus, Mohammed, Megatherion, Hermes, Pan, Priapus, Osiris, Melchizedek, Chem, Ammon, Mentu, Hercules, Orpheus, Odysseus, Virgilus, Catullus, Martialus, Rabelais, Swinburne, and many a holy bard, Apollonius, Timaeus, Simus Magus, Manes, Pythagoras, Basilides, Valentius, Bardesanes, Hippolytus, and transmitted the light of the Gnosis to us with their successors and their heirs, with Merlin, Arthur, Cameret, Percival, and many other prophet, priest, and king that bore the lance and the cup, the sword and the disc against the heathen. And these also Carolinus Magus and his paladins, William of Chiron, Frederick of Hostafern, Roger Bacon, Jacobus Burgundus, Molenius the Martyr, Christian Rosenkreutz, Ulrich von Hutten, Paracelsus, Michael Mayer, Roderick Borgia, Pope Alexander VI, Jacob Boehm, Francis Bacon, Lord Verulam, Andrea, Robertus Flabuctus, Johannes D., Sir Edward Kelly, Thomas Vaughan, Elias Ashmole, Molinius, Adam Weishaupt, Wolfgang von Goethe, Ludus Vicus Rex Bavariae, Richard Wagner, Alphonse Louis Constant, Friedrich Nietzsche, Hargrave Jennings, Karl Kellner, Forlog Duck, Sir Richard Francis Burton, Sir Richard Payne Knight, Paul Gauguin, Dr. Gerard N. Cass, Dr. Theodore Roos, and Sir Aleister Crowley, O Sons of the Lion and the Snake. And I'm going to just throw at the end of this list here Carl Jung and Rudolf Steiner, right? I think we can make our own list, right? That in a way, when Jung talks about the phenomenology of the self, I kind of feel like this is the topic of not such a necromantic thing, but more like a embracing the spirit. And this is where we get to this fantastic Paramahansa Yogananda book, which is about the resurrection of the Christ within you, right? So again, in the spirit of the confusion of necromancy, right, and the confusion of raising from the dead, isn't it just about spirit? Right, so I think that if we go into this book, the titling of this work, The Second Coming of Christ, is not referring to a literal return of Jesus to earth. He came 2,000 years ago, and after imparting a universal path to kingdom, was crucified and resurrected. His reappearance to the masses now is not necessary for the fulfillment of his teachings. What is necessary is for the cosmic wisdom and divine perception of Jesus to speak again through each one's own experience and understanding of the infinite Christ consciousness that was incarnate in Jesus. That will be his true second coming. Now, this is the difference between Jesus and Christ. Jesus was a name, Christ was the honorific. And Christ consciousness, now what's interesting too is this is by Paramananda Yogananda. In a way, Christ consciousness becomes Krishna consciousness, right? So again, it's not, necromancy kind of seems like a wrong way of putting it, right? So again, if we go back to Tolkien and we talk about Gandalf's role in Sauron, right? So Sauron comes back as a disembodied voice, but it's a disembodied voice of a shadow, right? It's a shadow voice. And we see this sort of, this story actually might be more familiar to many people in the story of Voldemort, right? Voldemort dies, but in his evil machinations, right? He allows his soul to be split into different parts, into these Horcruxes, right? Which is kind of similar to, and again, he's never fully back because part of him's in Harry Potter. This is the big reveal, spoiler, sorry. And part of him is in the snake, part of him is in different the journal, different objects throughout the world of Harry Potter. And he is never fully dead, but nor is he fully alive. And this is sort of like that Dark Lord side of this view. And we also have, when Voldemort is returning, right? He's the one whose name shall not be spoken, right? This is also sort of Sauron, and it's only Gandalf who's tasked, right? So here we're talking about Gandalf and Mithrandir. Ever most vigilant was Mithrandir, who is Gandalf, and he it was that most doubted the darkness in Mirkwood. For though many deemed it was wrought by the ring wraiths, he feared that it was indeed the first shadow of Sauron returning, and he went to Dol Guldur, and the sorcerer fled from him. And there was a watchful peace for a long while, but at the length the shadow returned, and its power increased. And in this time it was made the Council of the Wise that is called the White Council, and therein with Elrond and Galadriel and Círdan and the other lords of the Eldar. And with them was Mithrandir and Curunir, and that was Saruman the White, was chosen to be their chief. For he had most studied the devices of Sauron of old. Galadriel indeed had wished that Mithrandir should be the head of the council, and Saruman begrudged them that, for his pride and desire of mastery was grown great, but Mithrandir refused the office, since he would have no ties and no allegiance, save to those who sent him, and he would abide in no place, nor be subject to any summons. But Saruman now began to study the lore of the Ring of Power, and making their history. And in the oddest naming, telegraphic naming, like the guy who becomes corrupted by Sauron is called Saruman, right? It's so funny, right? It's so obvious. But again, I think this is kind of a good place to leave things. I think in that sense of we've gotten to the main points here that I wanted to bring up. So the idea here is Sauron, the Dark Lord, necromancy. Not only we see some variations of the necromantic spirit, right? So the idea here is not only is it raising from the dead, which we see as Lazarus, which is more done as a instructional miracle, display of miracle, but then we see the variations of the necromantic channel, which would be the Horcrux. Saruman goes under, lives in the shadow for a while, and then channels Morgoth, because we see that in a way Sauron is the cover band of Morgoth, right? Sauron is sort of just got Morgoth chained beneath the world in the blackness, right? In the void, Morgoth is down there. And now Sauron says, well, I can just tap into that same power, kind of like what's that David Bowie movie with the vampire? The Hunger, right? The Catherine Deneuve character, she's the queen of the vampire. She's Egyptian. She goes through various periods of immortal youth with her current lover. But after some point, the vampiric, demonic nature of her power is not equivalent to the vampires she creates in her boyfriends and her mates, right? So they end up corrupting, and she takes them and puts them in coffins and hides them up in the attic, right? So when David Bowie finally goes from beautiful David Bowie to, I was aging fast David Bowie, he was put into the box, and she says, oh, here's your new friend. You guys will be friends for eternity here. She goes to find a new lover, and her immortality goes on. So when we talk about the Dark Lords using necromancy, it's a bit different than raising from the dead. It's sort of like the necromantic arts around preserving their lich state, right? And this is where you see Sauron, in the end, cannot come back in body. He comes back as the eye on the tower, and he comes back in the ring. That's kind of like the original Horcrux. The rings of power in the Tolkien world are the original Horcruxes, right? So this is sort of lifted, but perpetuating the story. So the idea is the spirit can go into the object for the necromantic the self-necromancer. And we talk about cost of these things, just to go back to the Voldemort one and the Sauron one. The cost for Sauron is immateriality, right? He can see through a palantir, but he doesn't have an eye other than that fiery thing on a tower. So there's a certain loss of anything that has to do with humanity in the sense of this. So maybe Sauron in the Second Age is his most maybe evil as a being. It's like sort of his Jesus moment, right? And then once he's destroyed, now he's just like kind of a lingering presence, right? It's kind of gross, right? And I see that that's one of the weaknesses of this kind of model. Even Morgoth, going back to our previous topic, Morgoth as the Saturnine in the Black Cube, in the prison, the Iron Mountain prison, in the void. He still is the source of ultimate shadow, and now it's just Sauron who taps into it, right? So he's just a cover band, really, of it. And then Saruman's an even cheaper cover band of it, right? All the way down to the cheapest cover band of all, which is kind of like Gollum, right? Gollum is just the saddest cover band of Morgoth's evil. It's a frail being that's been destroyed by its by its intersection with this talismanic magic. So I think that's another. So the three uses of it is dying and rising gods, Osiris, Jesus, the art of resurrection, whether it's in self-resurrection through the spirit or through Lazarus as a white magic kind of thing, or kind of a grayish use of white magic, right? Then we have the Sauron type of thing, Morgoth going under and using necromantic arts to bring them back later. And then finally, the last one is just this kind of cover band concept, which is just the spirits of the dead is on the same frequency, I'd say, as the necromantic art. So that's my hot takes on this topic. Hope you enjoyed the Sauron topic, necromancy. Please check out our links below to help support the channel. Necromancy of Nyarlathotep is there. And we will come back next week with another Pontos Fathom podcast. I will also direct you guys to our Atlantis podcast. We did Silmarillion and Atlantis, talking about Numenor. And as I mentioned before, the Morgoth and Saturnine deity. Thanks for listening. Comments are welcome. We can talk down below, and if we get subscribers up to 1,000, let's try to open this up to a live podcast. Talk to you soon. Bye-bye.